morning.
Good morning.
Today I want to talk about a story by William Golding, the author of Lord of the Flies and all that stuff. It's about his childhood in a British public school and different kinds of thinking that he learned while he was there. But first I want to mention something, I'll give a handout since we don't have a blackboard, about how to read this kind of thing, how to read literary texts. Ordinarily, if you look at a text and you want to know what it meant, you're likely to say, well, what did the author mean it to mean? It's kind of circular, but that's the way people tend to think about meaning. Which is great as long as you can contact the author, or the author's agent, or publisher, or whatever. You have the author's email address, cell phone number. The author is alive. If the author's not alive, it's very difficult to contact the author. So it's difficult to tell what the author intended directly by asking. But there are strategies you can use to try to figure out what the author might have meant, including biographies, autobiographies, find out more about the person, and that person's life might give you some insight into why he or she was writing about a particular issue. You can look at other works by the same writer. Often you'll be reading things, especially in a college environment, that are kind of complicated or technical, but you might find that the author has written in a more popular venue a description of the same ideas. So if you read that, then you can go back to the one that you're reading and understand it better. You want to find out about contemporary responses to the author. What did the author's original audience think of the work? Did they write book reviews? Did the work begin a whole new branch of philosophy? Or was it utterly ignored at the time? Who knows? But it helps to find out, because those people would be in the best position to understand the author, because that's the audience for whom the author was writing. You want to find out about histories. This might be a person writing from a culture that you're not familiar with, or a time that you're not familiar with. And why are people so concerned about this thing? Well, maybe it was the biggest deal at the time in that particular culture. So it's not some trivial thing, or it's not something that's already been settled. It might have been settled at the time. And if it's written in English anyway, you want to have a look at the Oxford English Dictionary. I know this requires a lot of work. Sorry, college, you know. The Oxford English Dictionary is a wonderful thing because it took something like 60 years for the second edition to come out. Dozens and dozens of people worked on it for their entire careers. Not just because it lists every word in the language, along with yearly updates. A recent update was the word "don't." Homer Simpson's expression, please don't use that in your papers. It just records every word in the language. And the reason it took so long to compile it is because for every word where it's possible to discover, it gives you the first instance in print with each of its meanings. The sentence, the date, and where possible, the author. So if you're reading something written, say, in 1880 in the United States, probably 99% of the vocabulary will be the same as it is now. But some of the words might not have had the meaning that you associate with them until, say, 1960. And you can't attribute a 1960 meaning to a text that was written in 1880. So it's a good reality check on what the author might have been able to intend at the time. Now, this is the way most people read. They don't do it very systematically, but most people read this way, trying to figure out what did the author mean. And this is the way people read up until around 1900. Because at that point, all throughout the 1800s, a lot of technical advances were made that made life simpler, more manageable. There were a lot of advances in medicine, technology, electricity, various kinds of power, manufacturing, lots of different areas. And all those advances were based on formulas. You plug in information, you run it through the formula, you get the answer, and you can apply it immediately to make life better. That kind of hard science knowledge was much appreciated by most of the people that had benefited. But people who were doing that looked at historians and literary critics and began to ask, well, how can you guys rely on this stuff that you're using, you guys who look at texts? You really believe in autobiography? Come on. I mean, most people are going to say only the good stuff, and they're going to hide the stuff that isn't so good. Biographers are often a little bit too friendly or a little bit too harsh on the people they're writing about, so you can't put everything in a biography. There might not be any other works for you to contemplate. Or maybe you're reading the easy one. It might be a much more difficult version of it. Contemporary responses are not very good either, because a lot of the people whose work we still read today, we say they were ahead of their time, which means their contemporaries didn't understand them very well. I did my doctoral work on William Blake, English poet, 1757 to 1827, who was buried in a pauper's grave and thought insane by everybody. And it wasn't until about 90 years later that people figured out he wasn't crazy, he was just a hell of a lot smarter than everybody else. And he had this very complicated system worked out, brilliant. And now there's a whole industry of Blake scholarship, and he's regarded as one of the finest poets in the English language. So contemporary responses to Blake wouldn't help very much understanding him. Histories, those are written by the guys with the guns at the end of the war. Just try to find an unbiased history. Not an easy thing to do. The Oxford English Dictionary, on the other hand, is something you can trust. I was in England several years ago and met a guy who works for the Oxford English Dictionary. He was working on part of the letter M. Fascinating. Wonderful. Really an amazing guy. An enormous range of knowledge about things that began with M. But the cool thing about it is lexicographers have no ulterior motives. They're just interested in words, where they come from. So they're pretty straightforward. You can kind of trust the stuff because it's checked and double and triple checked before it gets into the dictionary. Well, some people in Tsarist Russia, later called the Russian formalists, took these criticisms to heart about these sources they were using to try to understand things. And they said, all right, we can look at a text, we can ignore this stuff. We'll look at a text the way you scientists look at a lab rat. And we're going to get the meaning right out of the text itself. We're not going to rely on all these maybe not so reliable sources. If we're going to look at the text, we're going to look at its features, grammar and syntax, just the logic of the language itself. We're not going to allow ourselves to paraphrase or summarize anything in a way that the texts wouldn't allow us to do. We're not going to violate that. We're going to look at logic, the connection between statements and entailments of ideas. And things that aren't on the page, too, that are necessary for understanding. There's an example, there was a 19th century French physiologist, Paul Broca, who discovered an area in the brain, right here, one of the speech areas, right? And this was the first time anybody knew what the brain was for, other than keeping your eyes from falling into your head. And he became very famous for this and wanted to know more about brains. So we run around to the morgues and gathered bodies and brains and stuff and measured them and weighed them and did things like that guys with microscopes do to brains. And he discovered, among other things, that women have smaller brains than men. What do you suppose people concluded from this? Huh? Well, duh, women are not as smart as men. And now we know why, because they're puny little brains, right? And people just leapt to this conclusion with no problem at all. Of course, if it's going to be true, there's something that's left out. It has to be true that brain size determines intelligence. But it doesn't. And there were no IQ tests at the time when Broca was doing his work. But later than that, many IQ tests given to millions of people around the world have shown that the curve for intelligence is the same in men and women There are a few really, really dumb men, well, average women, a few really, really smart men and women, but gender doesn't predict intelligence. So you can't conclude that women are less intelligent because of their brain size. In fact, they might have more efficient brains. Who knows? They can do the same thing with a smaller brain. I don't know. But part of the text for those who concluded from the fact that women have smaller brains, they concluded women are less intelligent. Part of the text that's not on the page for them, that has to be there, is brain size determines intelligence. So the part of the logic, when you look at the text itself, is between the lines of the text, the assumptions that are necessary for the claims of the text to be true. I also want to look at genre. What kind of text is it? Okay? If it's calling itself an essay, for example, it ought to be trying to prove something. If it's not, you gotta want, really, what is this? Why is it not? What's it trying to do? You know, what's going on here? Why is it not doing that? For example, the Italian sonnet, not necessarily written in Italian, has 8 lines about one thing and then a contrasting 6 lines at the end. If you find something that looks like an Italian sonnet, and you can tell by the rhyme scheme, say it's writing about love and hate. Love, hate. The fact that there's a contrast between the topics in the 2 parts of the poem isn't enough to make it an Italian sonnet. That's not the kind of contrast that you're looking for. Particularly if love and hate were described with the same kinds of figures of speech, the same kinds of end rhymes. If you see a thing like that where you expect a strong contrast because of the genre, and you don't find it, you can be pretty sure that the author intended to write an Italian sonnet because it's got the form, but something's missing. The strength of the contrast is diminished. So you can conclude from that in this poem, love and hate aren't as far apart as we generally think they are, and the poem is making a comment by the violation of a genre expectation. Okay? You can also look at the Oxford English Dictionary, this time not necessarily just to find out what did the words mean when the poem was written, or the story, or whatever it is, but to find out how far down into the words can you go and still have them support what's going on in the writing. There's a poem by John Milton, the English epic poet of the 17th century, who in his 50s went blind. And he lamented the fact that he'd gone blind because he wanted to serve God better, and he thought he couldn't do that if he were blind. He starts out his poem by saying, "When I consider how my light is spent." Okay? You could paraphrase that and say, when I think about the fact that I've gone blind. If you look up consider in a dictionary, it'll probably say, to think about. But if you look at its etymology, where it came from, it comes from a Latin phrase, considere, with the stars. So this phrase, with the stars, in Latin becomes to think about in English. How does that happen? Kind of weird. Originally, to consider was a nautical term. It's what you did when you were at sea at night and you couldn't see the land. You considered your position by looking at the stars. To use that as the third word in the poem about going blind is really pretty smooth, because he's in the dark. We, who don't study Latin anymore, have to go to the dictionary, look that up, and try to figure out what, with the stars, to think about. But Milton happens to have been the Latin secretary to Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England. All of his early poems were written in Latin. His teachers spoke in Latin in the classrooms. It was an international language of diplomacy. The audience for which he wrote that would immediately see what a perfect word that was in that poem. It's like, oh man, wow, got it. Beautiful word. But you only find that out by looking up the etymology of the words and seeing how strong is this piece of writing. How far down into the history of its materials can you go and still have this thing happening? Well, both of these require a lot of work. Whether you want to find the author's intention or whether you want to figure out what the text itself is telling you. There's another place to get meaning, and since about the middle of the 1960s, there's been a lot of attention on the reader's response. How do readers create meaning? Because if I say, give you a story, and you come in the next week and I say, well, what was that about? I'm going to get a lot of different responses. And many of them will be different, but also relevant and interesting. Well, how is that possible? Well, mainly because there's not necessarily one meaning to literary works. Okay? In some areas, you want one meaning. If you're going to say, how do you put the swing set together? Well, you want one way to do it. Otherwise, the kid's going to fall on the ground. But with literature, you can read it in many different ways. You get more out of it and different things out of it each time you read it. And the advantage of reader response is that you can bring to bear on the text you're reading things that were written and ideas that were developed after the original text was written. You can't do that with the author's intention school of reading because the author could not have intended an idea that hadn't been devised yet. Right? You can't do it with the text itself because it's not there. If you were to give somebody Shakespeare's Hamlet and Freud's General Introduction to Psychoanalysis translated by the same person without dates on it and names, the person reading the play would probably say, the person who wrote this play must have read that other book first, because Hamlet's a very Freudian play. And in fact, there's a wonderful book by one of Freud's students, Ernest Jones, called Hamlet and Oedipus. And there are dozens and dozens of essays and articles written about psychological, Freudian, Jungian, whatever aspects of Hamlet. But all of those ideas that are used to look back on this thing are not legitimate to find the author's intention. The name Freud does not appear in the text of Hamlet. Shakespeare died in 1616, Freud died in 1939. They did not know each other. Anyhow, given this little thing, you have to be careful when you find that you're having difficulty understanding something. Ask yourself, what am I trying to figure out? Am I trying to read the mind of the author? Give it up. Don't bother. You can't do that. This doesn't mean you shouldn't find out about the author, but it's not going to be very successful. You have to be very careful about applying things that you know that the author didn't know, the reader response stuff. And the best place to start is with the text itself. What does the text allow you to say about it? I'm going to read, then I'll hand out this piece by William Golding. And then I want to talk about some of the characteristics in it that are not immediately obvious, and do it by this kind of text itself kind of approach. While I was still a boy, I came to the conclusion that there were 3 grades of thinking. And since I was later to claim thinking as my hobby, I came to an even stranger conclusion, namely that I myself could not think at all. I must have been an unsatisfactory child for grown-ups to deal with. I remember how incomprehensible they appeared to me at first, but not, of course, how I appeared to them. It was the headmaster of my grammar school who first brought the subject of thinking before me, though neither in the way nor with the result he intended. He had some statuettes in his study. They stood in a high cupboard behind his desk. One was a lady wearing nothing but a bath towel. She seemed frozen in an eternal panic, lest the bath towel slip down any farther. And since she had no arms, she was in an unfortunate position to pull the towel up again. Next to her crouched the statuette of a leopard, ready to spring down at the top drawer of the filing cabinet labeled A through AH. My innocence interpreted this as the victim's last despairing cry. Ah! Not terribly despairing, was it? Beyond the leopard was a naked, muscular gentleman who sat looking down with his chin on his fist and his elbow on his knee. He seemed utterly miserable. Sometime later, I learned about these statuettes. The headmaster had placed them where they would face delinquent children, because they symbolized to him the whole of life. The naked lady was the Venus of Milo. She was love. She was not worried about the towel. She was just busy being beautiful. The leopard was nature, and he was being natural. The naked, muscular gentleman was not miserable. He was Rodin's thinker, an image of pure thought. It is easy to buy small plaster models of what you think life is like. I'd better explain that I was a frequent visitor to the headmaster's study because of the latest thing I had done or left undone. As we now say, I was not integrated. I was, if anything, disintegrated, and I was puzzled. Grown-ups never made sense. Whenever I found myself in a penal position before the headmaster's desk, with the statuettes glimmering whitely above him, I would sink my head, clasp my hands behind my back, and writhe one shoe over the other. The headmaster would look opaquely at me through flashing spectacles. "What are we going to do with you?" Well, what were they going to do with me? I would writhe my shoe some more and stare down at the worn rug. "Look up, boy, can't you look up?" Then I would look up at the cupboard, where the naked lady was frozen in her panic, and the muscular gentleman contemplated the hindquarters of the leopard in endless gloom. I had nothing to say to the headmaster. His spectacles caught the light so that you could see nothing human behind them. There was no possibility of communication. "Don't you ever think at all?" "No, I couldn't think, wasn't thinking, didn't think. I was simply waiting in anguish for the interview to stop." "Then you'd better learn, hadn't you?" On one occasion, the headmaster leaped to his feet, reached up and plonked Rodin's masterpiece on the desk before me. "That's what a man looks like when he's really thinking." Thanks so much. I surveyed the gentleman without interest or comprehension. "Go back to your class." Clearly there was something missing in me. Nature had endowed the rest of the human race with a sixth sense and left me out. This must be so, I mused on my way back to the class, since whether I had broken a window or failed to remember Boyle's Law or been late for school, my teachers produced me one adult answer. "Why can't you think?" As I saw the case, I'd broken the window because I tried to hit Jack Arney with a cricket ball and missed him. I couldn't remember Boyle's Law because I'd never bothered to learn it, and I was late for class because I preferred looking over the bridge into the river. In fact, I was wicked. Were my teachers, perhaps, so good that they could not understand the depths of my depravity? Were they clear, untormented people who could direct their every action by this mysterious business of thinking? The whole thing was incomprehensible. In my earlier years, I found even the statuette of the thinker confusing. I did not believe any of my teachers were naked, ever. Like someone born deaf but bitterly determined to find out about sound, I watched my teachers to find out about thought. It was Mr. Houghton. He was always telling me to think. With a modest satisfaction, he'd tell me that he'd thought a bit himself. Then why did he spend so much time drinking? Or was there more sense in drinking than there appeared to be? But if not, and if drinking were in fact ruinous to health, and Mr. Houghton was ruined, there was no doubt about that, why was he always talking about the clean life and the virtues of fresh air? He would spread his arms wide with the action of a man who habitually spent his time striding along mountain ridges. Sometimes, exalted by his own oratory, he would leap from his desk and hustle us outside into a hideous wind. "Oh, boys, deep breaths. Feel it right down inside you. Huge drafts of God's good air. Air, air." He would stand before us rejoicing in his perfect health, an open-air man. He'd put his hands on his waist and take a tremendous breath. You could hear the wind trapped in the cavern of his chest and struggling with all the unnatural impediments. His body would reel with shock, and his ruined face go white at the unaccustomed visitation. He would stagger back to his desk and collapse there, useless for the rest of the morning. Mr. Houghton was given to high-minded monologues about the good life, sexless and full of duty. Yet in the middle of one of these monologues, if a girl passed the window, tapping along on her neat little feet. He would interrupt his discourse. His neck would turn of itself, and he would watch her out of sight. In this instance, he seemed to me ruled not by a thought, but by an invisible and irresistible spring in his nape. His neck was an object of great interest to me. Normally, it bulged a bit over his collar. But Mr. Houghton had fought in the First World War alongside both Americans and French, and had come by who knows what illogic to a settled detestation of both countries. If either country happened to be prominent in current affairs, no argument could make Mr. Houghton think well of it. He would bang the desk. His neck would bulge still further and go red. "You can say what you like," he'd say, "but I've thought about this, and I know what I think." Mr. Houghton thought with his neck. It was Miss Parsons. She assured us that her dearest wish was our welfare, but I knew even then, with the mysterious clairvoyance of childhood, that what she wanted was the husband she never got. It was Mr. Hams, and so on. I've dealt with my teachers at length because this was my introduction to the nature of what is commonly called thought. Through them I discovered that thought was often full of unconscious prejudice, ignorance, and hypocrisy. It will lecture on disinterested purity while its neck is being remorselessly twisted toward a skirt. Technically, it's about as proficient as most businessmen's golf, as honest as most politicians' intentions, or to come near my own preoccupation, as coherent as most books that get written. It's what I came to call grade 3 thinking, though more properly it's feeling rather than thought. True, often there is a kind of innocence in prejudices, but in those days I viewed grade 3 thinking with an intolerant contempt and an incautious mockery. I delighted to confront a pious lady who hated the Germans with the proposition that we should love our enemies. She taught me a great truth in dealing with grade 3 thinkers. Because of her, I no longer dismiss lightly a mental process which for 9/10 of the population is the nearest they will ever get to thought. They have immense solidarity. We had better respect them, for we are surrounded and outnumbered. A crowd of grade 3 thinkers all shouting the same thing, all warming their hands at the fire of their own prejudices, will not thank you for pointing out the contradictions in their beliefs. Man is a gregarious animal and enjoys agreement, as cows will graze all the same way on the side of a hill. Grade 2 thinking is the detection of contradictions. I reached grade 2 when I trapped the poor pious lady. Grade 2 thinkers do not stampede easily, though often they fall into the other fault and lag behind. Grade 2 thinking is a withdrawal with eyes and ears open. It became my hobby and brought satisfaction and loneliness in either hand. For grade 2 thinking destroys without having the power to create. It set me watching the crowds cheering His Majesty the King and asking myself what all the fuss was about, without giving me anything positive to put in the place of that heady patriotism. But there were compensations. To hear people justify their habit of hunting foxes and tearing them to pieces by claiming that the foxes liked it. To hear our Prime Minister talk about the great benefit we conferred on India by jailing people like Pandit Nehru and Gandhi. To hear American politicians talk about peace in one sentence and refuse to join the League of Nations in the next. Yes, there were moments of delight. But I was growing toward adolescence and had to admit that Mr. Houghton was not the only one with an irresistible spring in his neck. I, too, felt the compulsive hand of nature and began to find that pointing out contradiction could be costly as well as fun. There was Ruth, for example, a serious and attractive girl. I was an atheist at the time. Grade 2 thinking is a menace to religion and knocks down sects like Skittles. I put myself in a position to be converted by her, with an hypocrisy worthy of grade 3. She was a Methodist, or at least her parents were, and Ruth had to follow suit. But, alas, instead of relying on the Holy Spirit to convert me, Ruth was foolish enough to open her pretty mouth in argument. She claimed that the Bible, King James Version, was literally inspired. I countered by saying that the Catholics believed in the literal inspiration of St. Jerome's Vulgate, and the two books were different. Argument flagged. At last she remarked that there were an awful lot of Methodists. They couldn't be wrong, could they? Not all those millions? That was too easy, said I restively, for the nearer you were to Ruth, the nicer she was to be near to. Since there were more Roman Catholics than Methodists anyway, they couldn't be wrong, could they? Not all those hundreds of millions? An awful flicker of doubt appeared in her eyes. I slid my arm round her waist and murmured breathlessly that if we were counting heads, the Buddhists were the boys for my money. But Ruth had really wanted to do me good because I was so nice. She fled. The combination of my arm and those countless Buddhists was too much for her. That night, her father visited my father and left red-cheeked and indignant. I was given the third degree to find out what had happened. It was lucky we were both of us only 14. I lost Ruth and gained an undeserved reputation as a potential libertine. So, grade 2 thinking can be dangerous. It was in this knowledge, at the age of 15, that I remember making a comment from the heights of grade 2 on the limitations of grade 3. One evening I found myself alone in the school hall, preparing it for a party. The door of the headmaster's study was open. I went in. The headmaster had ceased to thump Rodin's Thinker down on the desk as an example to the young. Perhaps he had not found any more candidates. But the statuettes were still there, glimmering and gathering dust on top of the cupboard. I stood in a chair and rearranged them. I stood Venus in her bath towel on the filing cabinet, so now the top drawer caught its breath in a gasp of sexy excitement. Portentous Thinker I placed on the edge of the cupboard so that he looked down at the bath towel and waited for it to slip. Grade 2 thinking, though it filled life with fun and excitement, did not make for content. To find out the deficiencies of our elders bolsters the young ego, but does not make for personal security. I found that grade 2 was not only the power to point out contradictions, it took the swimmer some distance from the shore and left him there, out of his depth. I decided that Pontius Pilate was a typical grade 2 thinker. What is truth, he said. A very common grade 2 thought, but one that is used always as the end of an argument instead of the beginning. There is a still higher grade of thought which says, what is truth, and sets out to find it. But these grade 1 thinkers were few and far between. They did not visit my grammar school in the flesh, though they were there in books. I aspired to them, partly because I was ambitious, and partly because I now saw my hobby as an unsatisfactory thing if it went no further. If you set out to climb a mountain, however high you climb, you have failed if you cannot reach the top. I did meet an undeniably grade 1 thinker in my first year at Oxford. I was looking over a small bridge in Magdalen Deer Park, and a tiny mustached and hatted figure came and stood by my side. He was a German who had just fled from the Nazis to Oxford as a temporary refuge. His name was Einstein. But Professor Einstein knew no English at the time, and I knew only 2 words of German. I beamed at him, trying wordlessly to convey by my bearing all the affection and respect that the English felt for him. It's possible, and I have to make the admission, that I felt here were 2 grade 1 thinkers standing side by side. Yet I doubt if my face conveyed more than a formless awe. I would have given my Greek and Latin and French and a good slice of my English for enough German to communicate, but we were divided. He was as inscrutable as my headmaster. For perhaps 5 minutes we stood together on the bridge, undeniable grade 1 thinker and breathless aspirant. With true greatness, Professor Einstein realized that any contact was better than none. He pointed to a trout wavering in midstream. He spoke. Fish. My brain reeled. Here I was, mingling with the great, and yet helpless as the veriest grade 3 thinker. Desperately I sought for some sign by which I might convey that I too revered pure reason. I nodded vehemently. In a brilliant flash, I used up half my German vocabulary. Fish! Ja! Ja! For perhaps another 5 minutes we stood together side by side. Then Professor Einstein, his whole figure still conveying goodwill and amiability, drifted away out of sight. I, too, would be a grade 1 thinker. I was irreverent at the best of times. Political and religious systems, social customs, loyalties and traditions, they all came tumbling down like so many rotten apples off a tree. This was a fine hobby, and a sensible substitute for cricket, since you could play it all the year round. I came up in the end with what must always remain the justification for grade 1 thinking, its sign, seal, and charter. I devised a coherent system for living. It was a moral system which was wholly logical. Of course, as I readily admitted, conversion of the world to my way of thinking might be difficult, since my system did away with the number of trifles such as big business, centralized government, armies, marriage. It was Ruth all over again. I had some very good friends who stood by me and still do, but my acquaintances vanished, taking the girls with them. Young women seemed oddly contented with the world as it was. They valued the meaningless ceremony with a ring. Young men, while willing to concede the chaining sordidness of marriage, were hesitant about abandoning the organizations which they hoped would give them a career. A young man on the first rung of the Royal Navy, while perfectly agreeable to doing away with big business and marriage, got as red-necked as Mr. Houghton when I proposed a world without any battleships in it. Had the game gone too far? Was it a game any longer? In those pre-war days, I stood to lose a great deal for the sake of a hobby. Now you're expecting me to describe how I saw the folly of my ways and came back to the warm nest where prejudices are so often called loyalties, where pointless actions are hallowed into custom by repetition, where we are content to say we think when all we do is feel. But you'd be wrong. I dropped my hobby and turned professional. If I were to go back to the headmaster's study and find the dusty statuettes still there, I would arrange them differently. I would dust Venus and put her aside, for I've come to love her and know her for the fair thing she is. But I'd put the thinker, sunk in his desperate thought, where there were shadows before him, and at his back I'd put the leopard, crouched and ready to spring. Now let me give you the text of this before we delve into it. Now, when I first taught this, it comes from the Borzoi College Reader, which has been used for a long time around here. This is in a chapter about various kinds of thinking. And I was just making a simple point about these three different kinds of thinking when I was about to go on to another essay in the chapter. And a student said, well, wait a minute. There's three kinds of thinking, but there's three something else's. What about that? What are the three other things in here? Anybody remember? Statues. Three different statues. Okay? So I'm thinking, okay, do these three statues have anything to do with the three grades of thinking? Why not figure it out? So I thought, okay, let's take a look at how they're first introduced. Because parallelism is a pretty common way of organizing things in stories and essays and poems or whatever. maybe the order in which these statues is introduced is the same order in which the grades of thinking were introduced. Okay? So we've got, first he sees Venus. Okay? Well, she might be tied in with grade 3, feeling rather than thought. Right? And she's a goddess of love, what do you want? Then he sees what? The leopard. Okay. Well, this could be grade 2, the detection of contradictions. And finally, he sees Rodin's thinker. He doesn't know he's Rodin's thinker yet. But he's just this big, muscular guy all bent up like this, thinking. Right? Well, he's a thinker, so that must be grade 1, right? All in his head. This looks pretty good. Venus is love, and it's, a feeling. That's feeling rather than thought. That's the definition of grade 3. The thinker is thinking, and he's like grade 1. He's the definition of that. But then, and I wanted to get the definitions down. I was trying to show people how to take notes. Then we look at the leopard, and what would be associated with the leopard? Detection of contradictions? It seems strange. Now there's a technique that I was trying to explain at that point that's used in the ancient world and even today about how to remember random things. If you practice this technique, you could listen to a series of 100 random numbers and be able to repeat it immediately, backwards, forward, skipping every third, fifth, eighth number, any way you want. And it involves associating what you want to remember with the weirdest image you can think of. So you imagine first your house, which you know pretty well. You walk in the front door, immediately to your left, there's a penguin smoking a cigarette with the number 42 written on its breast in lipstick. This is sufficiently weird that you're not going to forget it anytime soon. Over in the next corner, there's a little kids blow-up wading pool, and above it there's a little model airplane flying around it with a banner on the back that says 28. Now it takes some practice to get good at this, but the point is that you want to associate an image with the idea that you want to remember. So I said, okay, let's associate images with these grades of thinking. Now the example that he gives for grade 3 is Mr. Houghton, right? And he says, gives it one sentence paragraph, Mr. Houghton thought with his neck. Because he's looking at the girls walking by the window. So, okay, Houghton's Neck is a good example for that. It sounds like a place in Long Island, but there it is, Houghton's Neck. When he discovers, the first person he discovers with this grade 2, detection of contradictions, is the pious lady who hated the Germans. And he says, well, you should love our enemies. At which point she hits him with a handbag or something. But what really counted for him was Ruth. Because he lost Ruth. He was getting kind of moving in on Ruth there, but she split because she couldn't handle his arm in the Buddhists. Right? It's too much for her. So Ruth is a good example for the detection of contradictions, especially since she can't get beyond the contradiction, so she ran away. And, of course, Einstein is the thinker. Okay? So that looks pretty good. Venus, the feeling thing goes with Houghton's Neck, because he's looking at the girl. The thinker goes pretty well with grade 1, because he's the thinker. But then if you look at Ruth, it's the leopard is in that middle position. Ruth is nothing like a leopard at all. So at that point, I start to distinguish, I detect a contradiction between Ruth and the leopard, exactly where I should detect it in grade 2. Okay? So I'm thinking, well, let's look at the definitions again. Definition of grade 3 is feeling rather than thought. Now, which of these statue figures doesn't think? The thinker, the leopard, or the Venus? Which one doesn't think?
You would think the leopard.
The leopard, right? The leopard's an animal. It's not thinking. It's behaving instinctually, right? With its neck. So move the leopard up to grade 3. Then you move Venus to grade 2. You keep the thinker where the thinker is. Now you got feeling rather than thought. That's the leopard. Because Houghton's an animal. You got the detection of contradictions going on with Ruth as Venus. Well, Ruth is certainly his love goddess when he's 14 years old, so that seems to work pretty well. And you got the thinker and Einstein. Okay? At that point, this works pretty well. It works better in a horizontal mode than the first organization, which was just naive. He didn't even know what the statues represented at that time when he first saw them. But then I detect the contradiction in the vertical column, okay? Because what do you got? You've got, I'll give you the essay here. Now remember, this is, you got grade 3 is the leopard, the animal. Grade 2 is Venus, the goddess. Grade 1 is the thinker, the guy who looks like a very muscle-bound wrestler crunched up. Think about the order. Animal, deity, human being. Yeah? Wouldn't you think that the deity would be on top? The animal, human being, deity, right? The trouble with that is, Einstein doesn't look like Venus. Okay? Einstein looks like Yoda, because Einstein's eyes were the model for Yoda's eyes. Right? He's this rumply little guy. And you put the thinker, the human, in the middle. Ruth doesn't look anything like the thinker, but Ruth is stuck. When you're in that contradiction mode, you can't get out of it. You're stuck. Like the thinker is stuck trying to have a thought. He hasn't had one yet. Right? And that sculpture was designed by Rodin to be at the top of the gates of hell, which are these bronze doors that he made for a cathedral. So at the top of the gates of hell, that's where he puts the thinker. So it's this, that being stuck in a contradiction is far more hellish than being Mr. Houghton and looking at girls. You know, it's really awful. And a reason I wanted to justify why was I going to look at these things. There are two things that led me to want to pursue the correlation between the statuettes and the various kinds of thinking. One of them is on page 29, after he loses Ruth. It says, he goes into the school hall, and he says, the headmaster had ceased to thump Rodin's thinker on the desk as an example of the young. Perhaps he had not found any more candidates. This is one of these wonderful self-deprecating things that he says all the way through here. Like he was the last student, maybe, who had to be scolded by Houghton. It was not likely, but he's just playing around with that idea. And he takes the Venus and puts her on the filing cabinet, and then has the thinker looking at the bath towel waiting for it to slip. Right? What happened to the leopard? Leopard's gone. Because at this point, he thinks he can ignore the leopard, who is Mr. Houghton in the second arrangement of this stuff. The leopard will show up again later on. One other thing that I didn't see right away that made me really want to find out about these statues and stuff is on page 26. He goes into the headmaster's office and says, whenever I found myself in a penal position before the headmaster's desk, right, like he's out here, I'm the headmaster, with the statuettes glimmering whitely above him, behind the headmaster, up on the cupboard, I would sink my head, clasp my hands behind my back, and writhe one shoe over the other. He sinks his head like the head of the thinker, puts his hands behind his back so he looks armless like Venus, and writhes one shoe over the other like an animal waiting to escape. He's quoting the statues. No wonder Houghton thinks, or the headmaster thinks, that these represent the whole of life. Because every day he sees boys standing in front of his desk doing this kind of gesture, quoting the statues. Why do I say every day? Because he says, what were they going to do with me? I'd ride my shoe some more and stare down at the worn rug, worn from boys writhing one shoe over the other. This is wonderful. He meets Einstein. Fish. Yeah, nice going. And he has this wonderful little details like this. There's an oxymoron. You know what oxymoron is? A two-word contradiction, like military intelligence, the famous oxymoron. He says, perhaps 5 minutes we stood together on the bridge, undeniable grade 1 thinker and breathless aspirant. To aspire, it's part of the same word as respire or perspire. It has to do with breathing. But he's a breathless aspirant, which is a contradiction in terms. So he is stuck in a contradiction at this point with Einstein. He can't get up to that grade 1 level. In fact, even at the end, he doesn't put himself at grade 1. The Nobel Committee does that for him later on when they give him the Nobel Prize for Literature. But at the end of this, he says, if I were to go back there, now that he's already tried and failed to establish a grade 1 type world, right? You can do it in fiction, but you try to do it in the real world, it doesn't work too well. I would dust Venus and put her aside, for I come to love her and know her for the fair thing she is, grade 1 thinking, right? A kind of thinking above the ordinary human ability to think, which a goddess presumably would have. But I put the thinker sunk in his desperate thought, where there were shadows before him, and I want to push this a little bit and say the shadows are text. And at his back I put the leopard, crouched and ready to spring. Remember, the leopard now is Houghton, and people like Houghton, who say they think when all they do is feel. They are the enemies even of the second level of thought, which is detecting contradictions. And this reverses, by the way, the original position. On 26, the headmaster says to him, look up, boy, can't you look up? Then I would look up at the cupboard where the naked lady was frozen in her panic, and the muscular gentleman contemplated the hindquarters of the leopard in endless gloom. See, it's reversed at the end of this story. Now, the leopard is contemplating the thinker's hindquarters. It's like, so it's this kind of reversal. Okay? This is beautiful stuff. And it's the kind of thing that it's delicate. If, for example, I had focused on the pious lady who hated the Germans, I wouldn't have been able to figure this out. But Ruth, it's like, okay, that's what's really important to him, is Ruth. That lets the whole thing get rolling. There are probably lots of different ways to read this. I'm playing around with what can I justify by what's in the text itself. First, the naive idea that the introduction of the statues is parallel to the introduction of the kinds of thinking. Okay? That gets tossed out when I see that when I try to assign images to remember these kinds of thinking, which are all abstract statements. And it's like, there's a contradiction between Ruth and the leopard. There's something wrong with that. So then I go back to the definitions and say, what doesn't think? Oh, move the leopard up. The leopard doesn't think. Move the leopard into the third position. Right? And then it's the animal, vegetable, mineral, or the, animal, human being, goddess. Well, let's move that around. And get beyond appearances. That last order is beyond appearances because Ruth doesn't look like the thinker. Einstein doesn't look like Venus. But the kinds of thought that are represented by those statues are exactly what Ruth and Einstein are about. Okay? So grade 1 kind of thinking goes beyond appearances. Now, this is fun. Okay? If you like this kind of stuff, we have a lot of upper-level English classes in Middlesex County College. You might want to take a class and apply this to lots of other things. See, I'm not saying that Golding intended this kind of thing, but I secretly hope that he did, because it just comes out so beautifully. Let me give you the... This is an article published in the first issue of Middlesex Literary Journal. And it's about this particular thing. And you can see in it, if you look at it at greater length if you want to later to follow the argument a little better. But that's a literary reading. And it's a literary reading because literature allows you to find more and more and more in what you read. Whereas a lot of things that are more scientific, you don't want to have to read them more than once. There's no hidden meaning in them. It's all on the surface. It's all immediately useful. Literature is not immediately useful, usually. But if you live with it for a while, and you're willing to try to figure out what's going on between the lines, right? What's the unstated structure? What are the relationships between things not right next to each other, but throughout this whole thing? These statues keep on showing up. Now, he could have written about different kinds of thinking without bringing these statues in, but then that would just be thinking. But for him, this is thinking as a hobby. The hobby part is the statue part. He says, well, let's just seed this thing with some stuff and see what people do with it. Do you have any questions about this? You want to sign up for my class? I don't know. This is the kind of stuff, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it's kind of interesting, too, that it kind of starts out as man, woman, beast, and eventually it becomes man, beast, woman. So it's kind of like the hierarchy of the quality of the thought. So it's kind of like in a very simplistic way, kind of sexist almost.
Yeah, but see, Venus comes out on top. That's why I call this the elevation of Venus. She goes from being a representative of grade 3 to 2 to 1, all the way through this thing, which is really kind of cool. So, and Ruth gets left behind, but that's okay because she's stuck in this thinking thing. And Houghton, who cares about Houghton? Except that Golding really puts himself in a position not of Einstein. Golding puts himself in the position of the thinker, with shadows before him, the shadows of text, the shadows of representational knowledge, and the danger to people who even mess with that are people who don't think at all. And suddenly, Houghton becomes the most dangerous character in the whole thing. And if you look back at it. And as you read a thing like this, you have to read it forwards and then backwards. You read back to the beginning of it. And you can see this very interesting structure emerges, but only if you're willing to take the time to do it. And I didn't see that thing about the way he's standing in front of the headmaster's desk and quoting the statues. I must have read this 10 times before I said, oh, he's quoting the statues. Oh my God, look at that. How cool. And it's just, if it were all drawn or something, I probably would have seen it more readily. But I'm not that visual a person. I'm more of an ear kind of guy. I'm a poet, so I listen a lot. But then just trying to think about what these things look like. You can look this stuff up. Not the leopard. I mean, the leopard is just sort of generic, but the Venus of Milo and Rodin's Thinker, you can just Google those things for images and you can see what they look like. You can even find out where the gates of hell are in Rodin's big brass or bronze doors. Other questions, comments? Nobody's throwing anything at me. I'm happy. Okay, thank you for coming.
Thank you.